So if you look at the huge movement that is being made, and right now it's not a dynamic of what's right and what's wrong, it's a dynamic of what's heartfelt and what's mental. So there's very much that dynamic of energy going on in your world right now. Now, the realization is that if in fact you really are peacemakers, if in fact you really are problem solvers, then the fact is that you are opening yourself and opening your imaginations to new ideas. If you realize that you are opening yourself to these new things, you will not be nearly so surprised when they actually start to come to you. Right? And you're all, it's like we say, it's like that period around the year 2000 between the time that what shall we say, the great leap forward happened, which was the change of the millennium, and the first "Are you sure?" Because you're always going to get an "Are you sure?" especially if you have big changes. You know, we've said any number of times that the first "Are you sure?" for your country, for your world, was the selection, the election that happened in the year 2000. Now, let's see, no one here, but some were on a trip with us to Egypt during that dynamic, during that energy. And John wanted to be, but he has still been kicking himself in the ass that he didn't go, even all these years later. But we remember. So, but interestingly enough, the dynamics of energy are very similar to that time between the actual shift in consciousness and the first "Are you sure?" So the shift in consciousness happened in January, and the selection happened in November. So if you understand cosmic time and how the dynamics of cosmic time works, now we would say, and the reason is that you are being given an opportunity as a species to make a choice to see if you had gained enough maturity, enough wisdom to look at the dynamics of what were occurring and realize that this was a movement of consciousness, a movement of awareness. And when the dynamics of the unconditional love happened around the world. And of course, it's geocentric, depending on what part of the planet that you're on. Then the dynamic was that each of you had different influences, depending on what part of the world, what part of the country you were in, that was a response to these dynamics of energy. Each one of you had a personal dynamic, those that were incarnate, and as well as the response happening in the collective. So there was a collective dynamic of "Are you sure?" and response happening because of the growth. Mm-hmm. You know, the first test was the selection of George Bush in the year 2000, where he and Gore were fighting around Florida and hanging chads and all of that stuff. And what was the bigger question that was being asked? The bigger question that was being asked was, hey, this is who you say you are. You say you are of freedom. You say you are of liberty. You say you are of this and of that. And you say this is what it means to be an American. All right, well, let's challenge your election system and see how you respond. Well, instead of following the dynamic out patiently to the end and actually seeing what the result was, there became this whole game of manipulation that happened. And eventually, the Supreme Court had to decide who was the president for those next 4 years. Remember?
Yes.
So there was a choice there that you could have made, the more evolved, the more conscious choice that basically allowed them to have the wisdom and experience and patience to allow the dynamic to play out, to find out what the real story was. But instead it was rushed and all sorts of, it's kind of like this last couple of elections where all of this smoke has been thrown, all of this stuff has been thrown in a way so you don't get a clear picture of what the results of the election were. The first time that happened was in 2000, and you didn't answer that one very well. So what was the second, are you sure? The second, are you sure? Go ahead, Natalie.
Sorry, 9/11.
Yes. The second, are you sure, was the 9/11. Exactly right. And again, you were being given a choice. How were you going to respond to that situation? You know, how many of you are so conspiracy minded that you believe that you do not know the whole story around 9/11? Raise your hand. Oh. How many of you don't care? Interesting. Well, it wouldn't be so important, except that it keyed off the whole dynamic of energy that is existing even up until today.
Mm-hmm.
This whole dynamic of the emergence of Trump and all of that stuff came, you know, you can go all the way back to 1963. And really, that's where the seeds of this came from, the seeds of this energy. So now, after all of these years, it has reached a certain culmination point. What do you notice about this culmination point?
Well, I certainly felt a huge wave and likened it to 2000 because,
How about things are not really going according to plan?
well, it depends on whose plan you're looking at.
Any plan, we would suggest that all of you have been surprised in many ways over this past few months.
All right, so that suggests that maybe there's a divine hand in it that's beyond.
You think?
So we didn't do.
That's what we're trying to show you here. There is an underlying energetic dynamic, and if you can decipher that energetic dynamic and how it strikes you physically, emotionally, and spiritually, you don't have to doubt yourself or what you believe anymore, because it is a dynamic that's coming from the core of your truth, the core of who you are, because each of you are being challenged in a way that forces, if you do not do it voluntarily, forces choices upon you, right?